cops all thought this was the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And basically I said, you're going to love it. This is the greatest tool ever shoved down our throats.
Crime is a major problem facing any city, state, or country. Justice systems worldwide work to combat criminals and events of wrongdoing anywhere possible. But laws and codes for police conduct must be in place to assist law enforcement officers in every step of law enforcement. The principal steps being identifying those responsible, apprehending the suspect, interrogating or interviewing the suspect, and charging and sentencing them. Criminals are offered rights by the Constitution and its articles to not be forced into confessions during interrogations. Until recently, these rights were not recognized as important, but the recording of police interrogations as mandated by the Minnesota Supreme Court as a result of the Scales versus State decision was instrumental in preserving the rights of those accused by issuing further responsibilities to those investigating criminal acts. Early interrogation procedures are not similar in any way to practices of today. Although not legal, physical abuse was used to gain a confession and was often successful. This abuse was more similar with torture than interrogation. Suspects were beaten, deprived of food and water, and left in solitary confinement for extreme periods of time. Usually the officers would continue until a confession was reached, then hold a trial convicting the suspect the day after arrest. After that, it was a simple matter to sentence the suspects. These methods went largely uncontested until the decision of the case of Brown v. Mississippi on February 17, 1936. On March 30, 1934, 3 farmers, Arthur Ellington, Henry Shields, and Ed Brown, were accused of murdering Raymond Stewart. When the trial took place, the prosecution's only substantial evidence was the defendant's confessions. However, eyewitnesses attested to the fact that the confessions were obtained only after being subjected to savage beatings and whippings by the officers. In the official court reports, it is stated, "A day or two thereafter, the said deputy, accompanied by another, returned to the home of the said defendant and arrested him, and departed with the prisoner towards the jail in an adjoining county, but went by a route which led into the state of Alabama, and while on the way in that state, the deputy stopped and again severely whipped the defendant, declaring that he would continue the whipping until he confessed, and the defendant then agreed to confess to such a statement as the deputy would dictate, and he did so, after which he was delivered to jail. The defendants were still convicted of murder and sentenced to death. This case was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, where it determined that a confession gained by violence will not stand in a court of law, as it is not viable. With the 1934 resolution, police officers' interrogation tactics changed. They slowly switched to using verbal tricks to get criminals to incriminate themselves. But in 1966, another major reform came to the way interviews were used in court. The Supreme Court decision under the Warren Court in the case of Miranda v. Arizona was to be yet another change for law enforcement professionals nationwide. In the appeal of Miranda v. Arizona, 4 cases were examined of a similar nature. In the original case of Miranda v. Arizona, Ernesto Miranda, age 22, was the only suspect in a rape case of an 18-year-old girl. The only evidence against him was circumstantial evidence that he was in the area, and the victim's brother thought he looked like the perpetrator. He was interrogated for 2 hours, in which a written confession was signed. This was presented to the court, and Miranda was sentenced to 20 to 30 years imprisonment for kidnapping and rape. The Supreme Court sided with Miranda and stated, "The prosecution may not use statements, whether exculpatory or inculpatory, stemming from custodial interrogation of the defendant, unless it demonstrates the use of procedural safeguards effective to secure the privilege against self-incrimination. By custodial interrogation, we mean questioning initiated by law enforcement officers after a person has been taken into custody or otherwise deprived of his freedom of action in any significant way." This ruling places another new responsibility on police officers that all suspects being put under arrest must be informed of their right not to speak. This allows suspects to not incriminate themselves while restrained.
Now, we've decided as a society that we do have a right to remain silent, and we can't be compelled to be witnesses against ourselves. And that, of course, is a reaction from a couple of centuries ago when the people who created our Constitution said, look, we've seen inquisitorial systems in Europe. We've seen places where you can be required to talk to law enforcement. You can be required to talk to the state. We're not going to do it that way here. And so the right to remain silent is a fundamental right under our federal and state constitutions.
"25 years later, the Miranda rights brought up more questions of due process. On October 4th, 1992, Otha Brown was found stabbed to death in an alley in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The suspect in the murder was Michael Scales, who was living with Brown at the time. Scales was arrested, tried, and convicted of the murder. Scales appealed his case to the district court and was not successful. Scales appealed again, this time as the defendant, to the Minnesota Supreme Court. According to Scales, officers violated the Due Process Clause of the Constitution. This supposedly occurred because it was unclear if the arresting officers read the Miranda rights, and if they were understood. If Scales was not read his rights, or he was not in the capacity to understand those rights read to him, then there's no way that any testimony given by the defendant could have any real substance in the courtroom. On January 11, 2001, at the Supreme Court in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Judge Russell Anderson gave his decision. The evidence against Scales was so substantial that Scales' sentence could not be changed. The court added to the Uniform Rule of Criminal Procedure, or formally, the Guide to Due Process, that information about rights, any waiver, and all questioning shall be recorded where feasible, and must be recorded when the questioning occurs at a place of detention. If law enforcement officers fail to make an effort, or follow procedure, then any statement suspects make in response to interrogation is null and void.
Our homicide success rate goes off the chart. I mean, compared to other big cities in the nation that only have about a 65% solve rate for their murders, ours, 3 years in my 10 years in there, we had a 100% solve rate. We had a string of 29 solves in a row. We averaged well over 85% for the entire 10-year period. So, and I'm convinced recorded interrogations helped us with that solve rate.
Since then, recording has become a staple in the law enforcement community. Dash cams, which are mounted on the front of police cars, are there for use in the courtroom. As mandated in Minnesota, law enforcement officers are to record suspects' interviews anywhere practical. At any jail, police station, or holding area, there should be an audio recorder present with enough tape to capture the entire dialogue. A translator, if required, should be present and identified for the records with name and workplace. These regulations are in place to better protect the rights of those accused, but in doing so, put more responsibility on the officers.
Squad cars all have cameras, multiple cameras, shooting forward, shooting back, recording what's going on in the back seat. Officers are, many of them on the street are now driving around and walking around with digital recorders in their pockets. We're just seeing and hearing way more recorded evidence than we ever did when I started.
Those accused of committing a crime, whether they committed it or not, deserve to have their rights protected, as provided in the Constitution. The regulations set down by the Minnesota Supreme Court, as a result of an appeal by Scales, set in motion modern police practices. Commonplace now because of the ruling are the video recording and audio recording of all phases of due process. In having these tools, officers have more responsibilities, maintaining the equipment, operating the equipment, and making sure that their practices are ethical. It is the responsibility of every judicial system to ensure that every American citizen has certain unalienable rights, and fairness and due process are themes that are in place to protect the lives of all.